Given the time constraints, I will I will keep my comments brief, but also focus on 4 issues that I see pertinent to the argument. So the paper makes significant contributions on how we can think about notions of othering and how homo-nationalism, in a way, can stand in for new forms of colonizing. The first issue I want to take up is the concept of African homophobia, or what the authors call African homophobia. And sometimes it's used within inverted commas. And this, of course, is within the title itself. But as I was reading it, for me, it immediately conjured a crucial question asked by Berth Minor Alberg in her response to Caldwell and Caldwell's notion of African sexuality. And like Alberg, I'm compelled to ask, is there a distinct African homophobia? Other people have suggested and questioned these kinds of notions, and Mudumbe is one of them, who asserts that, and I quote, "Until now, Western interpreters as well as African analysts have been using categories and conceptual systems which depend on a Western epistemological order." Close quote. And I suppose my concern here is that the invention of concepts and categories such as African homophobia run the risk of doing exactly what Midumbe is talking about. Because this brings us to think about questions of framing and the questions about language and power, or how power exploits language, or how power plays in exploiting language. Within this, I'm also curious how considerations or significant positions and debates happening in South Africa around homophobia, or where homophobia is critiqued, have not been considered in the paper. And here I'm thinking of work by Deborah Emery, Sylvia Tamale, Mark Echtrecht, Neville Hode, etc. And so I would suggest, in thinking about homophobia in Africa, we need to perhaps theorize about what is it that we call African homophobia, and not just offer it as a given or an uncontested claim and category, because it is, I'll suggest, it is quite troubling. My second comment is around what the paper calls or suggests as the archive. So I want to think about the idea of the archive, and in the paper, the archive is talked about or mentioned in relation to questions around method and data. Particularly there, I would want to know how the archive is used in this case, and the extent of this archive. I mean, what is it? What does it consist of? And these questions are not only to enhance the methodological relevance of the paper, but also to trouble the notion of the archive itself. In this sense, being critical of the archive would also imply seeing the archive as more than just physical records, not just the newspaper articles, but also as a process of power, of exclusion and inclusion, as well as politics around the production of knowledge and collective memory. So my questions would be, how can we hear more about the wider archive that exists in Swedish media? But it's also important to recognize the power of the archive, within this paper, but also in framing Africa and issues around homophobia, etc. The third issue, my third comment, is around mapping, what the paper calls mapping. And perhaps the simplest place to start is to ask whether the maps found are types, because there are 3 kinds of maps, or 3 maps, and it wasn't clear whether these are 3 maps or 3 kinds of maps, or three maps that are in 3 articles. This is not very clear. International bodies such as Amnesty International, UK, or CityLab, ILGA, as the International Lesbian Gay Association, as the authors note, they have their own maps, and there's nothing unusual about mapping homophobia or mapping homosexuality. So, for example, Amnesty International has a map which has a color code pink for homosexuality, where homosexuality is illegal in all the countries in the world, and they have black for death penalty for homosexuality, for example. So there is this kind of mapping already taking place in Africa and in the world that maps anti-gay laws, etc. And many activists and activist websites use this kind of coding of mapping. Think of what again I want to call on Macaria's work, where he says these kinds of mapping, or suggesting that the world has to look in a particular way, because these are efforts that repackage colonial discourse, and they repackage this discourse for the consumption by Anglo-European, or in this case Nordic audiences. And I think, perhaps in the ways in which we write about what we see, we should also be quite critical of reproducing these kinds of discourses. This mapping is taking place in is also a kind of reproduction by media. So there's an agenda by funders, agenda by sponsors and advertisers, etc. And I was quite curious how this is not, the agenda of funders and sponsors is not taken up in the paper, particularly given the context in Uganda, because many of the articles are related to Uganda, and we know that the media, especially in Uganda, cannot be isolated from neoliberal politics. So, for example, what the Red Pepper tabloids did in Uganda, where it exposed a lot of people that they called homosexuals. And when activists started looking at this, they realized that there were bigger issues about who was funding these kinds of tabloids. And so there is an agenda to media. I know I've run out of time, but I do want to focus on one last issue, and that is on the question of homo-nationalism. So the argument that the paper puts forward is that, and I quote from the paper, maps function as imaginative tropes in constructing Swedish nationalist gay friendliness. And the thinking here is that that there's a nationalist discourse created by media or visual representations and sexuality. And there were a number of issues that I wanted to take up here. And perhaps the first issue I want to take up is, or something that I see as gaps that could be looked at in relation to the idea of nationalism or homo-nationalism. And the first is the link between poverty and sexuality. So, for example, it's suggested, although not highlighted in the paper, that a sexual progressiveness is linked to what it is, or Swedish nationalism, while the image of countries like Uganda, and this is an image of a poor and pre-modern country in terms of sexuality. So my question is, what is the space, or what does the work of the link between poverty and sexuality, how does it play in relation to homo-nationalism? And I think this could be taken up a little bit further in the paper. The second is perhaps what Jafari Allen calls political empathy porn. And this we see a lot in northern media, where black subjects must be cast as victims in order to gain visibility. And of course, I mean, you see this in this paper, it's noted, but there's impending the real solidarity or coalition building efforts that the North becomes, or even in this case, Sweden celebrates its progressiveness because of the downfall of the other. So it's kind of like the imperial projections of homophobia by northern nations, and I think this could be problematized even further. The third is that one can imagine that even in a space such as Sweden, there are pushbacks by activists or asylum seekers. I can imagine that there are these pushbacks. However, in the text, these pushbacks and the voices of activists and asylum seekers or refugees disappear as they do in the media articles or the reports that we've been given. And I think here the caution that I would raise is that we, and I say we as in those invested in the intellectual project, we also have to realize that because of diasporic connections, Africans and their relations with other nations or the media is not necessarily only about homo-nationalism or homonormative inclusion. I think there are other ways in which people who find themselves displaced or in diasporic spaces can speak back and give a different kind of narrative to what we see or what we want to see as homo-nationalism. And the fourth issue, which is my last issue, which is one of the things one of the gaps that I found quite troubling, and it is perhaps it's race, notions of race, thinking about race, an analysis of race in the paper is completely missing. And here I would say perhaps the work by Jackie Alexander could be looked at. And I suppose, and I, in my reading and in thinking about this, I think this is one of the crucial issues, because it is, after all, black bodies that are in these articles in Swedish media, or people racialized as Africans. And so to be silent about race is deeply problematic. And I'll end it.